To you, advocates of peace, honored students, and members of this distinguished institution, again, let me say how pleased I am. I'm especially pleased to be here in this well-recognized and renowned city of peace and reconciliation, whose tragedy and triumph goes far back into history. Today, I have the unique pleasure of discussing my beloved Liberia, our rich and contentious past, our hard-won but fragile peace, and our steady, progressive march toward democracy, with special attention to the role women played in facilitating and sustaining our peace initiative. I'll offer some thoughts on the challenges ahead as Liberia continues to consolidate peace, underscoring the significance of our October 2017 elections and the subsequent peaceful democratic transfer of power, our first in over 25 years. Before reflecting on Liberia, let me attempt to establish a fundamental understanding of the state of peace in the world today. Norwegian zoologist and the father of modern-day peace and conflict studies, John Galtung, makes a distinction between negative peace and positive peace. Negative peace is the absence of direct violence, and positive peace, the absence of structural violence. For Galtung, peace in any society is the sum of equity times harmony, divided by trauma times conflict. Peace, then, is maximized as we increase equity or the cooperation for mutual and equal benefit, and harmony being the level of reciprocity between parties, also understood as empathy or respect. Following Galtung, consolidating and maintaining peace in a society over the long term requires a special look into positive peace which creates the necessary conditions needed to address and diminish structural violence experienced by individuals and groups. According to the 2018 Global Peace Index, an annual analysis of global peace trends, further entrenchment of key conflicts in places like Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Yemen, have made the world less peaceful today than it has been at any time in the last decade. However, as a region, Sub-Saharan Africa is demonstrating strong improvements. For example, 3 of the top 5 global improvers in peace, the Gambia, Liberia, and Senegal, are on the continent. The Gambia recorded the largest change in ranking, moving in rank from 111 in 2017 to 76 in 2018, 35 spots up. Gambia's historic political transition from former President Yahya Jammeh to President Adama Barrow has led to improved relations with neighboring countries, most notably Senegal, and a series of reforms aimed at decentralizing power from the presidency and restoring checks and balances on the government for the first time in 22 years. Liberia follows the Gambia with the second largest change in ranking, moving up 27 spots. Much of our success is centered around the peaceful and successful conclusion of our 2017 elections. Despite a period of uncertainty around the elections, Liberia showed marked improvements in safety, security, and militarization, while showing a decrease in the likelihood of violent demonstrations and political terror. Throughout 2017 and around the elections, Liberia demonstrated a shared commitment to stability, valuing harmony across the country over potential violent conflict. How did we get there? Liberia's rich yet turbulent history is well known. In 2 decades, Liberia struggled with the effects of historical turbulence between the indigenous and settler populations. We survived years of military and dictatorial rule, coup d'etat, and successive civil wars. Thousands were killed and millions displaced. Moreover, the civil war in Liberia threatened to destabilize our entire sub-region. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, intervened, establishing the ECOWAS Monitoring Group, or ECOMOG, initially formed to separate the warring factions. ECOMOG's intervention to deploy ECOMOG marked the first concrete deployment of a regional security initiative on the continent. ECOMOG's intervention would expand through the 1990s to address several conflicts in the sub-region, often in conjunction with United Nations peacekeeping forces. The death and destruction from the conflicts were profound, and women and children bore the brunt of the suffering. They endured sexual violence, abductions, enslavement, and forced labor, not to mention the conscription into armed forces of expendable child soldiers. As the conflict moved on relentlessly, the resilient women of Liberia took charge, providing the pivotal push to ending the conflict. They took the path of peace, conducting grassroots campaign that challenged warring factions to come to the negotiating table. Women historically share a rich tradition of peace advocacy, participating at all times in leading modern peace movements. A 2016 United States Institute of Peace report titled Women in Nonviolent Movements found women's involvement in civil resistance movements to be a game changer. According to USIP, women have persisted in the face of inequalities, to assume roles as strategists, organizers, and active participants in various nonviolent campaigns and movements, despite historically being denied full access to political spaces. For example, Colombian women most recently played a pivotal role in addressing the conflict with the FARC, the largest running domestic conflict in the Western Hemisphere. Networks of feminists and peace activists, such as Peaceful Path and social movements of women against war, worked concurrently for 2 decades, demanding a negotiated settlement to the conflict. As talks were announced in 2012, established grassroots networks mobilized to amplify women's voices from across the country and work to ensure women would be seated at the negotiating table. The ensuing result of their advocacy effort included 2 high-profile women at the negotiating table and the establishment of a gender subcommission charged with safeguarding women's access and benefits to the accord, in the accord. Similarly, Liberian women from organizations such as Women in Peacebuilding Network, or WIPNET, confronted warring factions directly through the Women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace campaign to create pressure for the disarmament process to move forward. In 2003, ECOWAS, with support from the United States and the United Nations, brokered the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in Accra, Ghana, bringing an end to the war. Officially, there were 0 women negotiators, mediators, and signatories to the agreement. However, WIPNET followed the peace process to Accra and advocated strongly with the leaders of the warring factions, even staging a sit-in at State House as negotiations went on. WIPNET perfected the art of corridor diplomacy, speaking with negotiators during breaks, pushing the talks forward. Finally, on August 18, 2003, the Accra Comprehensive Peace Agreement brought an end to Liberia's armed conflict. In the end, women in civil society were recognized observers to the peace process and accounted for 17% of witnesses to the signing of the agreement. We should note that one of the key leaders of that effort was the third of the recipient of the 2011 Nobel Peace Prize, the other 2 invited as participants to this event. Prior to the formation of WIPNET, groups such as the Association of Female Liberian Lawyers, AFL, documented rape cases as a weapon of war. In 2000, they received authorization to prosecute rape cases in court. AFL would later be instrumental in drafting the legislation, which I signed, that increased the penalty of rape by making it a non-bailable offense. While MAWOPNET, the Mono River Women Peace Network, was another women's group of note advocating for peace. To avoid an all-out regional conflict, my WOPNet engaged in shuttle diplomacy among Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. My WOPNet successfully brought the presidents of 3 countries together in Rabat in 2002 and was recognized with the United Nations Prize in human rights, in the field of human rights, in 2003. Women in Liberia continued down the path of political activism following the 2003 Accra Peace Accord by conducting civic education, voter registration through the most remote areas of our country. They worked to ensure that every voice would be heard as we transition our country back to democratic rule. Liberians went to the polls in 2005 with nearly 80% of women voting in another woman whom they felt best prepared for the most arduous job in the country. I stand today on the shoulders of these strong, resourceful, and resilient women whose leadership, sacrifice, advocacy, and activism facilitated the Accra Comprehensive Peace Agreement and the enhanced role of women in the Liberian society. Through their action, Liberia obtained the first woman, and Africa obtained the first woman democratically elected as president of a nation. While those elections were a milestone for Liberia, the truest tests to our newly consolidated peace would come after the vote. There are, and still are, formidable challenges ahead for Liberia. My administration in 2006 inherited a war-torn country facing total economic collapse, destroyed infrastructure, dysfunctional institutions, a staggering external debt, a bloated civil service, and a societal culture shaped by decades of desperation, violence, and dependency. However, we understood then that the newly consolidated peace would be strongly linked to an agenda of inclusive growth and development, both of which will create equitable opportunities for all citizens. My administration went to work rebuilding the foundations for development, reestablishing Liberia within the community of nations, restoring relationships with the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and our bilateral partners, the United States and the United Kingdom, to receive the necessary technical and financial support for achieving macroeconomic stability. Next to economic reforms, we sought to enhance good governance, to develop our all but decimated democratic institutions, starting with the security sector, and to restore the rule of law to build confidence in the new and fragile peace. We made indisputable progress from 2005 to 2017. Our economy went from ground zero to achieving a growth rate of over 9% at its peak, among the highest on the continent at the time. Then, tragedy hit. The 2013 Ebola epidemic, creating shocks that drove economic growth close to 0%, and engendering an exodus from the country, creating a 2-year halt in key production-related activities. The epidemic ended in March 2015, and during the recovery period, the fragile economy climbed up to over 2% as other reconstruction and recovery efforts proceeded. Today, despite it all, Liberia is firmly rooted in democratic ideals, imbued with basic freedoms, and is an open society with the economic and political empowerment of women. Monrovia, our capital city, in the first time in decades, has running water and electricity, with penetration into much of the country. And all Liberians now share a realized collective dream of peace and prosperity for our country. Women continue to drive advocacy efforts for peace, and politically active, better educated, and represented across all branches of government. And in 2015, the United Nations recognized Liberia's commitment to promoting gender equality and women's empowerment in fulfillment of Millennium Goal number 3. Another marker of our peace, the UN peacekeeping mission in Liberia, UNMIL, ended on March 30 of this year, conferring full confidence in Liberia's security forces to operate in the best interest of the people. I am pleased to have hosted the UN first all-female peacekeeping force from India as part of UNMIL's mission. We Liberians will forever be grateful for UNMIL's role in our African brothers, in our subcontinent and across Africa, in our transition in peace, securing elections, promoting women's rights, and advancing reconstruction. Most of all, one of the markers of our trajectory of peace and democratic consolidation came earlier in the year as I retired from the presidency and handed the mantle of leadership to President George Weah. Liberia, for the first time in 75 years, successfully completed a peaceful transfer of power from one democratic elected president to another. The democratic transition from my administration to President Weah signifies an irreversible course for our country toward a peacefully consolidated democracy. There still are challenges awesome challenges for Liberia. A few weeks ago, we celebrated 15 consecutive years of peace, following 15 consecutive years of conflict. We have a promising and growing generation untouched by the trauma of armed conflict. A decade ago, Liberia ranked the 23rd most peaceful country in sub-Saharan Africa on the Global Peace Index. It now ranks 11 in the region. We have made significant strides against structural and direct violence, but yet we know Liberia continues to be a fragile state, requiring the continued support of its international partners. Also, global conditions and international relationships are fast changing and generating the need for laws, policies, and programs that promote resiliency. The African continent is one of the most vulnerable regions to climate change, and in Liberia, coastal habitats and farming systems remain susceptible to climate shocks. Advances in information technology and revolutionizing the communications and service delivery across sectors, connecting communities in a global village. How are we to ensure equitable access to the technologies of tomorrow? Women whose greater resilience brought peace to Liberia celebrate the freedom to shape their future, even though we still live in a patriarchal society. And youth today carry the unharnessed potential of our country, holding leaders accountable, calling for transparency and accountability as they seek economic opportunity. As I close, I'm proud to say that Liberia's greatest triumph has been securing our peaceful, free, and open society through the courage and dedication of Liberian women, a dedication we've openly shared with the world through a few of our great heroines, such as Dr. Angie Brooks Randolph. Angie Brooks was the only African woman to lead the United Nations General Assembly, where she championed in self-determination for all nations the liberation of Namibia from colonial rule. Her legacy endures in Liberia through the Angie Brooks International Center and a Women's Situation Room dedicated to developing women's leadership in political participation, peace, security, economic empowerment. I stand on the shoulder of Angie Brooks and all she represented for freedom, self-determination, and peace in our global environment. Thank you.
Will you take a few questions? Thank you very much.